It's not completely accurate to say that people with ADHD can't focus. Instead, people with ADHD can't focus when they're not interested in what they're doing.
Hi everyone, it's your host, Dr. Janice Castro on Latina ADHD. Before we get into today's episode, I want to remind you that this podcast and this episode is not a replacement for therapy. And yet, we have two licensed counseling psychologists today. So, a little bit about the guest, Dr. Kiara Manosalvas. That means in English, healing hands. Dr. Kiara Manosalvas is a licensed psychologist based in New York City, NYC, where she owns a private practice specializing in ADHD, anxiety, and complex trauma. She is passionate about supporting ambitious women of color who, despite their success, feel unfulfilled or disconnected from their purpose. Does that sound like you? Or maybe someone you know? Her expertise in ADHD, particularly in helping clients navigate emotion regulation challenges, has inspired her growing interest in couples therapy. Using emotional focused therapy, in the clinical world we call that EFT, she helps couples break patterns of disconnection and build stronger, more secure emotional bonds. In her practice, Dr. Manosalvas offers individual and couples therapy, comprehensive ADHD assessments, and coaching for women of color entrepreneurs with ADHD. She is also a faculty member at Teachers College at Columbia University, where she teaches in the Mental Health Counseling Master's Program and coordinates the bilingual Latina Mental Health Concentration. What beautiful career Dr. Kiara Manosalvas has created for herself. I love to hear all the various things that she is doing, that she is passionate about, and I'm excited for y'all to take a listen. So let's get into it. Thank you so much for being here, Kiara. This is a licensed psychologist, Dr. Manosalvas. I was just telling Dr. Manosalvas how much I love her last name because it has to do with healing hands. So, Kiara, thank you so much for being on the show. I want to learn more about you and the work that you do. So, I know that you identify as a Latina with ADHD, and you were also diagnosed as an adult, right? Like in your late 20s.
Yes.
And I'm curious, what were you up to during your late 20s? Were you in grad school? Were you already doing the things that you're doing now?
Yes, yeah. So it was a journey. So I'm 31, about to be 32. I was diagnosed in my mid 20s. I don't know exactly when, but I do know it was in my third year of my PhD program where I just started talking to being inside all the time. Because one of the things that I realize now in hindsight is I never worked from home because I couldn't. I always did everything at a coffee shop, at a library, with other people. I remember even literally living in Washington Heights at one point and really needing to do work. And this was before the pandemic, really needing to do work. I had like this huge assignment for my doc program due the next day. And it was like 10 p.m. at night and nothing was open at that point. And so I literally went to a Dominican spot that had like tables that I could sit on. And I went there and worked on my assignment just because it helped me like be outside with people to help me with that accountability.
Yeah.
But during the pandemic, that all went away, right? Because of lockdown. And I'd also lost my grandma to the pandemic. And so the grief, the anxiety, the ADHD that at the time I hadn't realized was ADHD, but I was struggling a lot.
Yeah.
And so I spoke to my therapist about it, which then prompted a conversation with my psychiatrist who I'd had a long relationship with. And quite frankly, it was a diagnosis that I had been unsure about for many years after that. So in 2020, I started taking medication for ADHD, which I'm happy to get more into, but it changed everything for me. It was really just like I remember the first time I took it, I cried because I just felt like, wow, this is like I'd always had a dream of like writing a book, but I'd always told myself that I would never be able to actually do that because I feel scattered all the time and I feel like I can't actually get myself to do something on my own. I have to really have a lot of scaffolding, a lot of support, and a book always felt like something I need to have a lot of intrinsic motivation for.
Mm.
And that was the first thing that came to mind is, wow, I maybe can actually do the thing that I wanted to do because this is helping me think that way. And so I had a lot of hesitancy around the diagnosis,
Mm.
particularly because it was a very quick assessment, which I find is very common. So it was like a 15-minute conversation with my psychiatrist. I filled out the adult ADHD self-report assessment. And we had many conversations, and I did a lot of work afterwards. A lot of my training also emphasized ADHD as well. I worked at the VA where I did a lot of ADHD work, but I was having a really hard time owning it for myself, even though I saw how much I was resonating with the symptoms and the struggles and how much medication was helping me. And it was once I graduated and had the financial privilege to be able to afford a full diagnostic assessment from a psychologist who specializes in ADHD that I did like the whole diagnostic assessment that really helped me bring clarity to exactly how I'm struggling,
Yeah.
where I was then diagnosed with ADHD. But the first time it was in 2020.
Okay, okay. I appreciate you kind of sharing a little bit about your journey with it because I know everyone's experiences are different and whatever emotions come up with it can vary. And also just sending my condolences. May your grandmother rest in peace. That's such a hard time to lose somebody during a global pandemic. And then you're still trying to navigate grad school. I know you said you're out in New York, and I know you identify as Latina. I am curious just because whenever I meet other people who are from the Latina community, I'm like, oh, what's your ethnicity? I'm
Yeah, of
curious what your
course.
background is.
Yeah, I'm Ecuadorian Puerto Rican. I was born here. My dad is Ecuadorian. He's an immigrant and he immigrated here when he married my mom. And then my mom is Ecuadorian Puerto Rican.
Okay, cool, cool. I'm so glad to have you here sharing a little bit about your experiences as a Latina too, because I know that sometimes the stigma within our Latina community can make it really hard for us to be able to get the help that we know could make a difference.
Hmm.
And it's not easy to just quickly go and get an assessment and be like, okay, this is what I got. What do I got to do next? Because there's so many emotions tied to, oh, now I have this diagnosis. What does that mean? And how do I move forward? And you talked about also getting your own professional experience. You got some training with ADHD, which I'm also eager to learn more about that. So I know you shared that you work with adults in high intensity fields with ADHD. I'm wondering, what do you mean by high intensity fields? Like, what are examples of careers or fields in that area?
Sure. So I would say the most, everyone has their own experiences at work, but I would say right now, the field that I'm seeing a lot of my clients in for ADHD coaching specifically is law. So I see a lot of lawyers. I also see a few entrepreneurs, and depending on the stress associated with building their business, how much help they have, I see a lot of high intensity work related to their entrepreneurship. But I would say that law definitely is the area that I see a lot of people in because of the demands of working at particularly a big law firm while also struggling with ADHD and whether or not the firm is supportive in accommodations and workplace support. And so, but
Yeah.
that's what I do a lot of right now.
Okay, so I'm wondering if you could share with us what shows up for women of color with ADHD when it comes to being in these high intensity work fields, like either being an entrepreneur or being at a law firm. I'm curious because I know that with ADHD, well, what we do know is that it can be hard to manage emotions. And so, yeah, I'm just curious, how does it show up for women of color with ADHD at these types of work environments or fields?
Yeah. So, what I find is that women of color already are held to such a standard
Mm.
that they, regardless of whether or not they have ADHD, they're already held to a standard that is quite high, and they often hold themselves to a very high standard, oftentimes without even necessarily having the pressure, right, from external sources. Sometimes they certainly do, right? And a lot of my clients certainly do, but sometimes it's all self-imposed. And so, one of the things that I find really important to do in my work with clients, whether I'm doing therapy or coaching with ADHD,
Mhm.
is really being able to understand where are all the big and intense emotions coming from? Are they being exacerbated by sort of the messages and the expectations that are being put upon you? So whether it be your boss or your parents or your partner or your siblings, right? Like how are they potentially contributing to it? Because I'm very relational in how I practice, right? So I don't see the problem existing within the person. One of the things that I really believe is important in doing with clients is helping them understand that my goal is never to pathologize their experiences. I'm never trying to have them feel like something is wrong with them because they have ADHD. Certainly, I want to validate the struggles and I want to validate the very real challenges that come with ADHD. But I also want to make sure that people understand how it also creates this zone of genius because of the hyper focus, because of the attention that is suddenly super strong because of the ways that our brains work. And so I put a lot of emphasis on really helping people understand what their zone of genius is. And I find that with emotion regulation and teaching clients how to regulate their emotions, if they are doing something that they're not interested in, then it can be very hard for my clients and for myself included to do the task anyway. And so, for instance, if someone is working at a job that they aren't feeling particularly motivated by or inspired by, or they feel kind of just stuck, their brains, because of there's so many different neurological aspects, and we know that ADHD is very much a neurological condition, right? While it is also very much present throughout the lifespan, what we know is that the brains and the neuroimaging of people with ADHD, we have very different brains, right? In terms of our prefrontal cortex, in terms of our amygdala, and the ways that the structures of our brain communicate with one another. And so what I tell people, particularly women of color when I'm working with them, is there are some things that are genuinely harder for us to do because of these changes in our brains, right? Because of these differences in our brain. And it doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. All that means is that we now need to figure out how to work through this situation in a way that helps you feel motivated, in a way that actually works for you, right? Not just a cookie cutter approach. And so if one person really needs to study for an exam or really needs to get something to their boss in on time, but they're not feeling that intrinsic motivation to be able to actually do that, large part of my work is helping them understand what exactly are they not motivated by, what exactly is going on in their work environment that feels lackluster to them, and how can we really emphasize their strengths? How can we really emphasize what they're good at to help them understand what they do get excited about, right? What their zone of genius actually is. Because I find that when emotion dysregulation is a major issue in a person's life, or what's bringing them to treatment, or what's bringing them to coaching, I really like to help a person recognize that it is a struggle related to heightened emotional reactivity and difficulty recovering from emotional distress and challenges in self-soothing, all of these elements of ADHD that are very common within ADHD and also have a very unique way of presenting and showing up in women of color because of the societal messages that we get about how we're supposed to look, how we're supposed to talk, how smart we're supposed to be. I think all of that plays into how a person experiences what they're going through.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you sharing so many parts of it that impact the way that women of color with ADHD show up. You went from talking about how what we know with ADHD is that it is a neurobiological disorder. And so it has to do, like you said, with the prefrontal cortex, thinking about also the amygdala and just thinking about how our brains process emotions. But then when you mix that with societal expectations and how whether it's a partner, family, your boss, or even those messages that then are ingrained in ourselves as women, and then as women in general, I know we tend to create these pressures ourselves because we've been hearing it from others so much. But when you're struggling with ADHD, it can be really challenging when you start to have difficulties with feeling overwhelmed easily or experiencing stress quickly, and then how that starts to impact either how you're showing up at work. And you brought up something so important. Well, I mean, everything you said was important, but something that stood out to me was that intrinsic motivation. And I'm wondering if you could just briefly share what, for our audience members who may not know what intrinsic motivation is, what does that mean?
Yeah. So something that I like to say is it's not completely accurate to say that people with ADHD can't focus. Instead, people with ADHD can't focus when they're not interested in what they're doing. Because if we find something that we're very interested in, that we have a lot of intrinsic motivation for, meaning we are internally motivated, we have the excitement about starting a task and completing a task. And of course, there are challenges, right? Unique challenges that come up along the way, right? Maybe it's harder to stay on schedule. Maybe it's harder to be consistent. but it doesn't feel as if you have to try to complete the task out of brute force, for instance, because you actually genuinely enjoy it. Whereas if you are being asked to do something you don't want to do, you either A, don't do it, right? And that certainly has consequences. Or what I see in a lot of women of color is you do it, but you do it because you put that expectation on yourself that you have to do it, and you go through brute force, right? And you kind of just go and do the task, even if it is at the risk of your own sanity, your own mental health, or compromises your well-being in some type of way, because you have internalized these messages that unless you are this level of productive, or unless you show up in this type of way at work or in the classroom, you're not going to be deemed competent, you're not going to be taken seriously. And I think for women of color, that's a very real fear that we have, right? Whether you're Latino, whether you're Black, whether you're Asian, Indigenous, and all of those unique racial ethnic identities have unique experiences as well, right? I also want to address that Black women have a very unique and specific experience because of anti-racism and anti-Blackness, even within Latino communities. But overall, what I really emphasize is that let's figure out what genuinely brings you joy. And yes, there are some things that may feel like you have to push yourself to get it done, but that it becomes a lot easier to work on your strengths if we know what your strengths are. And if we know how you then feel as you're operating in those strengths. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much for expanding on that. And as you were talking about focusing on those strengths, it reminded me of another term you used that I was wondering if you could break it down for us a little bit. Is this zone of genius?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yes. So I'll use a personal example because I think that's just one of the best ways to kind of explain where I'm going at it with. I have always been someone who loved thinking big picture. I always thought of myself as creative. I did musical theater growing up. I've always been a theater kid. I've always been very expressive. That's why I really love teaching, because teaching really allows me to kind of show up and be expressive and bold and creative in the classroom. And I love mentoring and working with students. And so for me, that's what I consider my zone of genius, like public speaking, really being able to connect with people, really being able to help a person recognize their strengths, right? And so I see that as my zone of genius because it is something that I do that I think I am naturally gifted in. That, yes, I work hard to expand on those skills. The fact that I have a PhD in counseling also helps, but for me, those are things that are sort of just ingrained to my heart and soul. My mom always tells the joke that when I was little, she would always lose me in the supermarket because I would be running up and down the aisles and dancing to whatever song I was obsessed with at the time. And so I've always loved being active and being all over the place. So that is my zone of genius. What is not my zone of genius is math or anything that is very rigid or very structured. So I really struggled in math as a kid. I remember being sent out to the remedial classes in math. I did horrible on my SATs and my GREs. I did like 98th percentile in writing and reading, but then I got like 6th percentile in math. It was such a stark difference.
Yeah.
And what I find for women, particularly women of color, is that we pay so much attention to the 6th percentile in math, and we don't give enough attention to the fact that you did 98th percentile in writing, right? Like I did so well in some of these areas, but I was so hyper fixated and so feeling so much shame about the fact that I still use my fingers to do math, right? Or that I get really anxious when I waitressed a lot as I was growing up. Like I would get really anxious if I didn't have like a calculator as I was working, right? And so for me, I've had to work really hard to reduce that internalization of like, okay, I have things that I'm not good at, and that's normal. That's okay. Everyone has things they're not good at.
Right.
But what is my zone of genius? And let me operate in that lane, because that is where I feel best. That is where I feel like I contribute most to the world, to the people that I work with. And it also helps me feel good, right? Like I have this like intrinsic motivation.
There you go. There's that word.
Yeah. So.
I see the connections there. Thank you so much for just explaining that piece, because it's so important, especially when we're trying to talk about ADHD from a strength-based approach, about how, yes, there are challenges. And we talked a little bit about how that shows up for women of color, especially with regulating emotions. And remembering to also focus on some of these strengths that come up and what are the passions what is that zone of genius so that you can tap into that intrinsic motivation to keep you going.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, what can women of color with ADHD do to be able to manage their emotions or to help them feel more in control of their emotions and really tap into the things that they want to focus on? Because as you emphasize, it's not that people with ADHD don't focus or can't focus or they don't want to. It's that they're looking for something that's interesting to them so that they can focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say start with identifying what your strengths are. And this could be with a therapist. There are so many different ways of assessing your strengths, right? There's the Clifton Strengths Finder, there's the VIA character strengths, right? There's all these different assessments that you could take. So I always say start there because I think that provides a lot of information. And then if you are able to work with the provider, a therapist or a coach or a psychiatrist, whoever, really emphasize that you want to really share that you want to emphasize strengths in treatment, right? That as much
Mm,
as you want to talk about the things that you're struggling with, how can you also leverage your strengths to help you feel more connected to what your zone of genius is or to discover what your zone of genius is?
yeah.
For me, I think one of the things that's also very important is teaching clients that I work with that some of these skills and strategies that I teach them to be able to regulate their emotions, so coping skills, are not going to feel good at first, right? They're not going to feel natural. They're not going to feel easy. Maybe it feels hard to actually go out and go on a run, for instance, or go on a walk outside, right? Maybe it's more familiar, right, for you to really kind of sit and feel really overwhelmed and try to navigate a to-do list in that moment of overwhelm, as opposed to doing something that actually helps you regulate your emotions. And so one of the things that I tell clients is it requires time and practice to be able to have these skills feel like second nature. And one of the things that is also very important in terms of the ongoing journey of coping skills and emotion regulation. Was never really like a runner growing up, but I took up running during the pandemic also to cope and regulate. And I went through a really tough time, obviously, as I mentioned, during the pandemic. And I picked up running. And one of the things that really stood out to me is how often I didn't feel like going, how often I didn't want to run
Mm,
because I was upset or I was stressed with school or I was upset over someone I was dating or I was upset about how life was feeling because it was 2020, 2021. And one of the things that most surprised me is how much I allowed myself to, yes, let myself be sad, but then also go out and do the thing that I know is going to make me feel better, even if I didn't want to do it in the moment. And so,
yeah.
this idea of self care, even when we don't feel like it, is such an important piece of the work that I do. And that my experience is that self care doesn't always feel easy, right? Especially the
Right.
self care that is like most impactful for me. 90% of the time, I don't want to do it. And so, I've had to really practice and build that muscle so that it does feel automatic when I'm at a point of distress, so that I automatically reach for the positive coping mechanism as opposed to the unhealthy one to be able to regulate my emotions. But it takes time. So,
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you highlighting that. It does require a lot of patience and being able to acknowledge how it doesn't mean you are going to feel super excited to do the self care or the coping strategies when you're experiencing the overwhelm or the stress in the moment. And while we can say, like, I don't feel like doing this and I'm going to do it anyways, is part of building that muscle, like you said, so that
yep.
we do have these tools. Because I agree with you. I think that the self care piece is so essential for folks with ADHD. And it's so helpful to hear your process with it and normalizing how, like, yeah, it's going to be hard at first, it's going to feel uncomfortable. And knowing that when you're in therapy or when you have ADHD coaching clients, you're there to support them in the process and exploring, like, what are your strengths and what are some barriers coming up so that we can keep you in this zone of genius and also keep you with your self-care toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things for me is I have people that I work with who are on different relationships to the title of ADHD, right? Some people really own it and really feel like it describes what they're going through. Other people are understandably more hesitant about acknowledging that they have ADHD or that they struggle with ADHD. But I think regardless of whether or not, for people that are listening to this podcast, right, obviously there is an interest in either supporting yourself with ADHD or supporting someone you love with ADHD. But I think the reality of the world and society is that focus is very hard, right? We live in a world that is really conditioned to reduce our focus every single time we log onto social media, every single time we check our email. And it's a very natural response to a unnatural system, this inability to really sit down and do the thing that we really love. And so I teach people that these skills are helpful for everyone.
Yeah.
And also at the same time, if you have ADHD, some of these skills will be harder. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It doesn't mean that something is wrong with you. Allow yourself to have a process that isn't linear, right? Allow yourself to have a process that doesn't go from A to Z in one perfect line. Because if my experience has taught me anything, it's that it is very non-linear, right? It's very all over the place. I'm still learning coping strategies. I'm still learning what works best for me. And I very recently owned the fact that I always suspected I had ADHD, particularly during my doc program when I got a lot of signs and a lot of things that were telling me that I thought and my brain worked differently than some people that I was in the program with. But for me, I really needed to go through that process of feeling unsure in order to really understand myself, as opposed to kind of just taking the diagnosis as it was and just saying, I have ADHD, right? Like I had to go through that process of figuring out for myself, okay, what does this mean for me? I'm not the hyperactive young boy that I have 3 brothers. 2 of them were actually diagnosed with ADHD as kids because they were the class clown. They were running all over the place. They were in detention all the time. I was like in my room, obsessed with Harry Potter, obsessed with Neopets, very much in my own world. But I was always called spacey. I was always called a daydreamer. And so I've had to learn that ADHD in women tends to look different. And so rather than comparing myself to this mold that research, unfortunately, has really set up to make us think that ADHD is only a white, hyperactive young boy, how can I validate my experiences while knowing that my experiences are different from the norm? So,
yeah, definitely. When I think about all these intersecting identities that you have as a Latina and in graduate program, where I know we both have our PhDs, and I just in general, while I know we went to different schools, we know that in our field, it is predominantly white. And so very quickly, this imposter phenomenon starts to show up and you start to wonder like, okay, I'm different, but why am I different? Oh, and there's just so many things, right? It's like, oh, I learn differently maybe because I'm a person of color or because I'm a woman and these systems weren't built for women of color. Or is it ADHD? Or is it that I'm just going through something right now? It's so hard to untangle all of that. And that's why it's also challenging for women of color to get that diagnosis, in addition to the fact that, yeah, the research has often just portrayed it as what does it look like for a white hyperactive boy?
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your experiences as a Latina with ADHD, how you've seen it show up for women of color with ADHD, for example, like you said, with either lawyers or entrepreneurs in their professions, and just the different ways that they can cope with some of these emotions and feel more in control with self-care, as well as being able to use resources like coaching or therapy as a support system. For our listeners, I'm curious if you have any offerings that you would like to share, and whether it's therapy, speaking engagements, anything that comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah. You're all welcome to follow me on Instagram, Dr. Kiara.Manosalvas. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes.
Yeah.
I also recently decided to start a YouTube channel. So you can look me up. It's called In Session with Dr. Kiara.
Nice.
I only have 1 video up right now. So I'm
one is more than 0.
Exactly. 1 is more than 0. So I'm creating the systems that I need now to be consistent with that. But I would love for people to follow me on there. But otherwise, if you're a client if you're someone that lives in New York and you're looking for a therapist and you feel like I might be a good fit, feel free to reach out and we can see what that would look like. But otherwise, this was really fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. It was so great to have Dr. Kiara Manosalvas on the Latina ADHD podcast and hearing about her own personal experiences being diagnosed with ADHD in her 20s and navigating what it's like to be diagnosed, starting medication, and how she reacted to that, And then also being able to hear about her expertise as she works with women of color with ADHD in these high intensive careers, whether it's entrepreneurship or lawyers. And I really enjoyed hearing about her perspective coming from a strength-based approach, that when you have ADHD, it's not that you can't focus. It's about tapping into what is interesting to you, what are your intrinsic motivators, and how do we hone into that zone of genius so that you can focus on the things that bring you joy, that bring you this passion from inside of you, to be able to feel like you can do things and you can focus. You're just trying to figure out what you want to focus on. So thank you so much for listening, and take care.